When we think about sins in Christianity, certain actions come to mind, those that deeply violate God's commandments and disrupt our relationship with Him. Today, we will dive into one of the most serious sins, idolatry, which often goes unnoticed in our modern lives, even though it can have serious spiritual consequences. Idolatry, at its core, is the act of placing something or someone above God. Many people associate it with the image of golden statues or ancient gods, but idolatry is far more subtle. It's about our hearts, our desires, and the things we prioritize above our relationship with God. In Exodus chapter 20, verse 3, God made it crystal clear, "You shall have no other gods before me." This wasn't just a rule for ancient times. It speaks directly to our present. So, what does idolatry look like today? It can be anything that occupies a place in your heart that should belong to God alone. It could be money, success, material possessions, fame, or even relationships. While none of these things are inherently bad, they become dangerous when we elevate them to the status of a god in our lives. When we start relying on them for happiness, security, or validation, we are committing the sin of idolatry. The Bible shows us time and time again how idolatry leads to destruction. The Israelites, after being freed from Egypt, were led astray by idols. They crafted a golden calf and worshipped it, even though God had just delivered them from slavery. This act of idolatry brought severe consequences upon them because they turned their backs on the one who had saved them. And yet, this story is not just about ancient Israel, it's about us. How often do we turn to golden calves in our lives when we should be turning to God? Idolatry is dangerous because it draws us away from our purpose. It promises fulfillment, but leaves us empty. We end up placing our trust in things that cannot deliver us, cannot save us, and cannot give us the peace that only God can offer. In modern society, we see this manifesting in the pursuit of wealth at the cost of relationships, or in the addiction to social validation through platforms like social media, where the number of likes or followers becomes an idol. These false gods don't just take the place of the true God, they enslave us. But idolatry isn't always about external things. Sometimes it's internal. We can idolize our own ideas, our independence, our success, or even our appearance. Anything that becomes the central focus of our lives, above God, becomes an idol. And the more we focus on these things, the more distant we become from the true source of our strength and peace. So, how do we recognize idolatry in our lives? It often comes down to what we are willing to sacrifice for. If we are sacrificing time with God for the pursuit of success, money, or status, then we're making idols of those things. If we're compromising our values to please others or to climb the social ladder, we're bowing to false gods. The danger is real. Idolatry, in its many forms, can lead to a life that feels disconnected, where we chase after fleeting pleasures, but nothing ever truly satisfies. It's a dangerous cycle that many fall into without even realizing it. But here's the good news. There's always a way back. God is always ready to forgive and restore, no matter how far we've strayed. He invites us to tear down the idols in our lives and return to Him. Now that we've explored the deep impact of idolatry, it's time to dive into the next grave sin in Christianity, adultery. Adultery is a sin that strikes at the heart of relationships, particularly the sacred bond of marriage. In God's eyes, marriage is not just a social contract, it's a holy covenant, one that mirrors the relationship between God and His people. When someone commits adultery, they are not just breaking a promise, they are shattering trust and violating the sanctity of that union. Jesus addresses this directly in Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 to 28, where He expands on the concept of adultery. You have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Here, Jesus moves beyond the physical act and shines a light on the root of the sin, our thoughts and desires. Adultery doesn't begin with a physical betrayal. It begins in the heart. A lustful glance, a wandering thought, an emotional attachment to someone outside of the marriage. All of these are the seeds of adultery. And like any sin, it grows if it's not addressed. Adultery devastates not just the individuals involved, but entire families and communities. It erodes trust, breaks hearts, and often leaves scars that take a lifetime to heal. In Proverbs chapter 6, verse 32, the Bible warns us of the consequences. But a man who commits adultery has no sense. Whoever does so destroys himself. It's a sin that brings destruction, not only to relationships, but to the sinner's soul as well. What makes adultery so insidious is how it often starts small. A casual flirtation, an innocent conversation that turns into something more. Before long, lines are crossed, and what seemed harmless becomes harmful. That's why Jesus emphasizes the importance of guarding our hearts and minds. Adultery is more than an act. It's a reflection of where our priorities lie. Are we honoring the commitments we've made, not just to our spouses, but to God? Or are we seeking momentary pleasure at the expense of long-term trust and love? But just like idolatry, there's a way back. Even in the midst of betrayal, forgiveness is possible. Adultery is a grave sin, yes, but it is not beyond redemption. In John chapter 8, verses 3 to 11, when the woman caught in adultery is brought before Jesus, He doesn't condemn her. Instead, He tells her, "Go now and leave your life of sin." That's the beauty of God's grace. It's available to anyone willing to repent, to turn away from their sin and return to Him. Now let's turn to the final sin in our exploration, murder. Murder is perhaps the most universally condemned sin. To take a life is to violate the very essence of God's creation. In Exodus chapter 20, verse 13, the commandment is simple. You shall not murder. Life is sacred, and only God has the authority to give and take it. When someone commits murder, they are not just harming another person. They are rebelling against God's authority over life and death. But just as Jesus deepened the understanding of adultery, He does the same with murder. In Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 to 22, He says, "You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'You shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment.' But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Here, Jesus takes murder out of the physical realm and places it squarely in the heart. Anger, bitterness, hatred, these are the seeds of murder. While we may not physically take someone's life, how often do we harbor anger in our hearts? How often do we allow grudges to fester, cutting people off emotionally and spiritually? Jesus makes it clear that murder begins long before the act. It begins with our thoughts and attitudes. And this is why forgiveness is so critical in the Christian faith. Holding on to anger and resentment can be just as destructive as physical violence. It poisons our relationships and distances us from God. But the good news is that Jesus offers a path of healing. In Matthew chapter 5, verses 23 to 24, Jesus urges us to reconcile with those we are angry with. If you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them. Then come and offer your gift. Reconciliation is not just a suggestion. It's a commandment, a way to restore what anger has destroyed. As we reflect on these three grave sins, idolatry, adultery, and murder, it's important to remember that while these sins are serious, they are not beyond the reach of God's grace. We serve a God who is both just and merciful. He offers forgiveness to anyone who repents and seeks Him with a sincere heart. So, as you consider these teachings, ask yourself, are there areas in your life where you have allowed idols to take God's place? Are there relationships where trust has been broken or anger has taken root? If so, know that it's never too late to turn back to God, to seek His forgiveness and restoration. If this message has touched you, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Share this with someone you care about, someone who might need to hear these truths today. And as always, may God bless you on your journey of faith.